In this video, we're going to consider biotechnology from the past. So, first of all, biotechnology, what is it? It is the use of living systems and organisms to make products or to help solve problems or to satisfy our needs or wants. Here's an ancient example of bread making in Egypt in this image. Let's consider some biotechnologies in the past from the indigenous people of Australia, and there's been plenty of examples around Australia of aquaculture, so that's fisheries. It's like farming but from water. The Torres Strait Islander people of the Badoo Island group, which is just up here off the north coast of Queensland, in the Torres Strait, they were the ones doing tidal fishing weirs. So they built structures, weirs that held back the water that filled when the tides came in, and when the tide receded, they stayed full of water and they were able to fish there safely. Some of the oldest man-made structures on Earth are in this sort of region of New South Wales here, and they are the fish traps found where the Ngamba and Murrawarra peoples, they would build semicircular shaped fish traps so that when the fish moved upstream, they would get kind of confused by the patterns of stones in the water and be trapped, and then the people could just walk into the river and catch the fish by hand or by spear. And recently receiving UNESCO World Heritage listing in Victoria are the Budgebim eel traps, and those are nearly 7,000 years old, and they are built on the flow from an ancient volcano, and there are lots of basalt rocks that have been moved into position into channels to make the eels swim through certain gaps, making them really easy to trap. And the practices there were very sustainable because only eels of a certain size were caught, allowing the mature females to go through and breed so that there would be more eels for the next season. Another example of exploiting living organisms or manipulating living organisms is the practice of burning, and that's practiced all across Australia. There are many examples, so I've just pinpointed one particular one here from Western Australia. So in this kind of region of Western Australia, where the Wunambal Gambera people would do something called savanna burning. So they would burn large areas of forestry, and that would take the trees very low. It would allow grasses to come through, and they could use the rich soil to grow yams and kangaroo grasses and all sorts of other things, and it would encourage wildlife in as well as vegetation. So it's a great way to be sustainable and farm using the technique of burning to control the vegetation and the wildlife. And the next example is another one that's really common, and there are many examples of this which we'll look at in Module 7 when we're thinking about medicine, but an example local to us, the tea tree tea, which is Melaleuca alterniflora, is indigenous to New South Wales, so especially along the coastal areas of New South Wales. So in the Northern Rivers area, the tea tree is used for antiseptic properties, treating cuts, burns, used as a poultice to put onto bruises and swelling. So all sorts of uses for tea tree as antiseptic. So that's another way of exploiting plants for our benefit, so some medicine. But if we think about some things that are perhaps slightly more recent, we have had lots of past biotechnology examples in agriculture, including selective breeding, so developing new varieties of sweet corn, for example, from the wild type varieties, giving us crops that fit our mechanized usage now, so easier to harvest, that kind of thing. And for many thousands of years, we've been fermenting foods and drinks to allow them to keep for longer. So there's a few examples here, everything from sort of yogurt and bread making and sourdough bread, or pickling vegetables like sauerkraut, making healthy drinks, but made healthy, but not because they were healthy, but because they would keep for longer, and they also happen to be healthy. So that's a great example of manipulating microbes to keep things preserved for us. There are also examples in agriculture of biological control, so using one organism to control another organism. And the prickly pear was introduced in Australia, and we have very successful control of that when we use a moth larvae, so a caterpillar from a moth, and the moth's called Cactoblastis moth, and the caterpillar from that moth is incredibly prolific at chewing away at those cacti. So that's a good example of successful use of one organism against another in agriculture. We've also used biotechnologies in industry, and I've got two examples here using bacteria. Back in the 1920s was the first time that bacterial sludge was used in sewage treatment, and you can see over here they've got aeration units, and the aeration units were important because it was bubbling air through the sludge, which meant that the bacteria had oxygen, and because they had oxygen they could grow quickly, so you had efficient digestion of the sewage. And 1989 there was a very famous oil spill in Alaska from a vessel called the Exxon Valdez, and it was a huge oil spill. You can see the headline here, and it actually travelled from where it happened, which was over here at the Prince William Sound, all the way down the coast of Alaska, so 470 miles, and it kept moving. The spill was at the end of March, and it kept going all the way through to the end of May, but they used bacteria in amongst the oil to help break it down, so that the environmental effect could be lessened. And the last example of using biotechnologies in the past is for medical applications. So in the 1940s, was the first time that we started producing penicillin in mass production. So penicillin is from a fungus. It's a naturally produced chemical, but there were some Australians involved in the mass production process, and they worked out how to get it in large amounts, and therefore you could make it in pills and fluids, so you could use it for treatment. We also were extracting insulin for diabetics. Back in the 1920s, we extracted it from pigs and from cattle, from using their pancreas to get it from them. And then, and that's an example of biotechnology, because we're using an organism to get something we want. And then we changed from using pigs and cattle as the source, and we got a human insulin gene and popped it into bacteria in the 1970s, and now we have genetically modified insulin that we can use to treat people with diabetes. But that was a long time ago. 1978 is a long time ago, so we can consider that a past biotechnology, even though we are still using that type of technology today. And in 1984, a really interesting mouse was made at Harvard University called an onco mouse. And an onco mouse, onco means cancer, a little prefix. So we made a mouse that was susceptible to cancer, so we could use that mouse to develop lots of cancers in it, and then we could treat those cancers, or see if we could treat those cancers. So we genetically engineered this mouse, and it was the first animal to be patented. So it's quite an interesting little mouse, and it's still doing great work today. Obviously not the same mouse, but the same idea of that onco mouse. It's still being used to help us work out how to treat cancer today.